Welcome everyone. We're live right now. So, Kevin, thank you very much. You can start your presentation whenever you're ready.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm a little fragmented because I just went through some fun technical issues getting this set up. So did not really have as much time to play with the platform as I would like. So bear with me as I figure this out. The session that you're currently in is called Drupal is Dead, Long Live Drupal. It should be an interesting conversation, I think. I gave a similar kind of talk maybe at DrupalCon Austin when I did the State of DevOps presentation. You're more than welcome to go back and review that. It's on YouTube if you'd like to look it up. But very similar points then as I'm making now. And I think that they still are pretty relevant. The big difference is now I have a lot more insight from a business perspective of how some of these problems might actually translate into solutions. So basic agenda for what we're going to do is we're going to go through 3 different sections. We're going to talk a little bit about how Drupal has changed. We're going to talk about what those changes might mean for the future of the project in the greater open source ecosystem. And we're going to talk about how to cope with all of this change. Drupal is Dead is completely tongue-in-cheek. It's parodying the old chant, the queen is dead, long live the queen. When one monarch passed away, and another rose to the throne, the role remains the same, but the occupant changes. In our case, Drupal, as we used to know at 15 years, or at least 15 years and 4 months ago when I started contributing, is dead and gone. And a new Drupal has taken its place. I've been in this community for a significant amount of time. I've seen a lot of changes. I've helped grow Drupal in significant ways. And I have nothing but gratitude for the community and the things that it has taught me. This project has changed my life and it has changed the lives of millions of people. It is a very positive effort. It is a very positive energy, but I think there are things that can make it a little bit better. This is also a time to be extra thoughtful about our technology, our community, and our place in the broader ecosystem in the world. There are several sessions at DrupalCon about Drupal 9 specifically, so this is not really going to go into too many technical details, so much as talk about the open source ethos. So let's talk a little bit about how Drupal has changed. Major changes in Drupal this year, basically in the preceding 12 months. Number 1, Acquia is now owned by Vista Equity Partners. This is a significant change. Not a lot of people talk about this accurately, so we'll touch on this in a little bit. Significant migration from Drupal 8 to Drupal 9 has been designed to be as easy as possible. I remember doing Drupal before migrate modules existed or before anybody had a good system for doing that. And doing migrations was the single most problematic, expensive thing that you could do moving from one version of Drupal to another. So I find it to be really encouraging that this is a first-class citizen now in Drupal 9. It's a huge win for everybody. Drupal is closely tracking Symfony and PHP lifecycles. So a lot of what we're going to be touching on is getting more in touch with the open source communities that surround Drupal and really participating in them. And I think that this is a really good stride in that direction. We've moved from Drupal specific simple tests. I worked with Jimmy Berry and Randy Fay and a bunch of others way back in the day to help put together some of the first iterations of the simple testing framework. And it's really great to see all of that being gutted and replaced with something that is more industry standard, that is easier for outside Drupal people to be able to understand. I think that's going to have significant ramifications for the future of the project. We've got some amazing work happening with Drupal themes like Olivero and Claro. These are really helping to address some of the usability issues that I might touch on a little bit in this session, really helping to address some of the learning curve for some of the newer people that are starting to use Drupal. And I think it's making fantastic strides towards really lowering the bar of entry for Drupal in a lot of ways for a lot of people. So there's a lot of positives. We've got more dependency changes for 9.0. We've had major updates with Twig, Symfony, Composer. There's a lot of major updated components underneath the hood in Drupal now, and that's pretty fantastic. Drupal, however, doesn't really stand on its own. There's a lot of adjacent projects that we really need to pay attention to in order to be really effective with Drupal. And in 2020, Drupal can serve as just one piece of a really complex puzzle of services and tools that are needed to create and deploy a relevant contemporary project. Contemporary basically means that you move outside of the things that you're historically used to, and you start to see some new players enter into the field. You get things like the Cloud Native Foundation, you get things like Docker, you get your traditional PHP systems like Composer, and you have a whole host of additional projects that are spanning up outside of the maybe not outside of the Drupal space, but as ancillary efforts to be able to provide functionality that is not being provided by the core project. These include tools like DDEV, Lando, Doxel. You've heard a host of these Docker-based development tools coming up. And I think it's very healthy. The competition is good. The ability to focus on problems holistically and as a community is good. And I think it's really fantastic. These days, Drupal is pretty popular as a decoupled CMS background that's moving it in the right direction. Pairing it with front-end frameworks like Gatsby and Vue.js is a fantastic move. It opens up the doors for many new contributors and is really a great way of moving. We rely a lot on other projects to support and pair with Drupal or well beyond contrib modules. Composer and the shift to an object-oriented approach brought Drupal more in line with the broader PHP community, which of course is when Backdrop forked Drupal to stay on a different path. There's some debate, when Backdrop forked as, the concept of simple core, maybe that was a better direction for Drupal. We're going to talk a lot about making sure that we're addressing the right problems in the space. And there's a debate as to whether Drupal chose to address the right problems when that division ended up happening. But we'll get into that in a little bit. So let's go over a couple of quotes. We're going to start with Preston So. Today, headless CMSs are all the rage among developers due to their front-end agnosticism and rich developer ecosystems. Unbridled builders who have chafed against the restrictions that outdated presentation layers and traditional web-based CMSs long imposed. It's leading to an environment where headless CMSs are by developers, for developers, and legacy CMSs are for everyone else. So here's an interesting thing. I've been involved in a lot of business circles and a lot of business conversations, and I'm on a lot of mailing lists and technical related conversations. In every instance across those lists, when anybody on that list asks how to get their content, how to publish their website, what's the best way of very rapidly prototyping an idea, I have never once seen Drupal recommended, period. There is nobody in these circles in this contemporary world that is defaulting to Drupal to be able to quickly and easily get their message out in a secure way. You're dealing with enterprise adoption at this point that is willing to take on additional complexity to solve more complex needs, right? Other CMSs have data built with API access in mind, and it's a different structure. So if you're going to go the Jamstack route, you compile everything out of Drupal into JS every time it changes. Just using Drupal as the backend because you happen to have Drupal around, it's not the future. It's something that we need to really address and understand. So in order to really address it, we need to understand what Drupal is really good at. Maybe still it's the full front end, back end, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's a smaller component. Maybe it's a set of services. Maybe it's the ability for people to extend in a very rapid way. Maybe it's being able to output, much like Vue does, in different formats. You want static HTML, you want JavaScript, you want, any number of things. And that's what we really need to focus on. So there have been a number of changes to how we contribute. These are very interesting to me for a number of reasons. You know, we have new issue forks and merge requests are available, following a more familiar workflow from GitHub open source work. Patches are still available as forks are new as of November 2020. You know, I don't mean to come across as cynical or anything like that, but we were working with pull requests with Drupal in 2012 when we built examiner.com. We needed to, because working with patches is a very different way of doing things. It's not in alignment with the broader open source world. That is something that Drupal, I think, can stand to learn a little bit from. I'll just keep going. So one of the coolest things I think that's happened in the past year for Drupal is the relationship between the Drupal Association and Tugboat, and Simply Test Me, I think. So basically, the Drupal Association, Simply Test Me, Lullabot, and Tugboat work together to provide environments for Drupal projects that are pull-based. So whenever you submit a pull request, you have the ability to go and evaluate that site in real time based off of the code. It's a very similar system to what we have working with, you know, with DDev Live. And it's very effective for people. So what we're finding is that the ability to very and quickly spin up these things to give you these sites that provide additional context into what you're working on removes massive amounts of barriers for people. It really lowers the bar of entry for a lot of folks. And I think that that's really important. I just can't congratulate these folks enough for this. The contribution process itself has now changed for code contributors. With the move to GitLab and merge request, contributors have a somewhat less complex path to offering and reviewing changes. The risk here is that any change will also cause existing users to drop off. So as much as I think that, you know, personally, pull requests are fine and maybe should have been implemented earlier, there are people out there that can only work with patches for whatever reason. When we make a change like this, we isolate and we cast those people off if they're not willing to make the change to move themselves forward. It's an interesting paradigm. It's something that we need to think about, that we need to be aware of. I don't know if you've noticed this, but the Drupal community has opinions, and that's great. That's why we're pretty happy with the diversity of solutions available for various problems. That's the spirit of open source. Debate about these things is really good as long as what you're doing is getting to the root problem and you're solving the right root problem. And I think that that is the lesson that we can all learn from a little bit more. What those changes might mean for the future of the project and the greater open source ecosystem. Basically, I think everything's like a pendulum, right? And I think that this pendulum centers around our ability as humans to learn and understand. So whenever you have a bunch of engineers in a room, those engineers are going to solve problems that are specific to engineers. And they're going to do it in very engineer-focused ways. One of the things that I've learned over time is that when an engineer creates a solution to a problem, it's likely technical in nature and might be a little bit difficult for a non-technical human to understand or interact with. That pendulum needs to swing between those two extremes until it finds a happy medium, and then both sides of the equation can equally engage in it. I see this consistently in technology. I see it, with Kubernetes. Everybody wants to use Kubernetes. Now that's coming back. I see it with Docker. Everybody wants to use Docker. Now that's coming back. And that's another case study that we'll get into. It's a very interesting thing. So it's just, you have to take time to understand what you're doing. You have to maybe not evaluate the shiny. It's very easy to go to extremes. A good example would be the RDFA conversation. And I don't know how many of you remember DrupalCon, I think possibly Denver, maybe a little bit earlier. Dries got up on stage for this keynote and, sold RDFA as the next major development in the internet, and something that Drupal was going to embrace wholeheartedly. It did have positive effects, but it in no way, shape, or form lived up to the expectation that Dries had set for the community. And that's a very good example of that pendulum. The expectation was very high. Reality brought it back a little bit more to the medium. And now we have a very functional implementation of RDFA that is very useful, but not quite what we thought it was going to be. By working closely with other open source projects and communities to define and create agnostic best practices, as well as software solutions, we can help support each other as our own CMS changes. This is the ethos of why I created the company that I've created, DDev. Let me give you an example of how this can work that's specific to Drupal. So, when views was brought into Drupal core, there was a very interesting decision that was made, right? And that was to make views a part of Drupal core. If we had stepped back and maybe evaluated things a little bit differently and said, okay, well, what we really need is a generic tool that will transform information from a multitude of data sources and output it into a multiple set of formats, JSON, XML, HTML, whatever we want. And we make that as an independent project that is designed to have generic interfaces so that it can be used in any project instead of just Drupal. And instead, we maybe keep a smaller version of Drupal that we can really do really well. And we do that. So basically what you have now is two separate projects, kind of like maybe the Cloud Native Foundation looks over a multitude of projects. Let's say, for example, another CMS comes along and they happen to be PHP based. They're looking for a query builder, essentially. They suddenly realize, hey, this great person from the Drupal community came to my meetup in Germany or whatever, and explained to me that they've got this really great tool. It's agnostic. I can use it in a variety of ways. So let's pull it into our project. So instead of creating a lot of overhead, a lot of security issues, a lot of problems really to solve the specific editorial issues that we were experiencing at the time, may not have been the right decision. Because what you did is you neglected to capitalize on those different communities and experience the world as a larger whole. And it's possible that you have blocked people from contributing to the project in different ways as a result of it. And that's just a hypothetical. There's a lot of different ways of looking at these things. So I encourage you to just kind of really think about the roots of what we're doing, why things exist the way they do. How can they really be better? First of all, Drupal is not dead, but I would argue it's not in a healthy place relative to competing projects as it was in its heyday in the early 2010s. This is from Jeff Gearling. In Drupal's case, a major effort was made in Drupal 8 to get off the island and replace many core APIs and systems with Symfony and other PHP ecosystem libraries. It was an ambitious effort, and Drupal today is a pretty well architected PHP application, but it broke the implicit trust developers built over many prior releases. Product process has to fit how the user works or wants to work, not the ideal engineers thinks is best. So here's an interesting thing that I've learned over time. Engineers cannot traditionally write a business case statement. And I've seen it, I've done it many, many times. I can't define things without using technical jargon. And what I've discovered is that when I go through and evaluate the problem and I try to define what that problem is and I read it, I'll write it, I'll pause, I'll go take a break, drink a cup of coffee, whatever, come back, read it. And if there's anything technical in there, I need to take it out and continue that iterative process until finally I'm left with the pure essence of what that problem is as it relates to humans. We need to get better at articulating things from a human perspective so that we know that we're architecting and engineering the correct solutions to problems. And I don't think that we've done that because we're good engineers. We're an exceptional community of amazing engineers, and we are very likely to jump onto engineering first approaches to solving problems. That might be why in those mailing lists and in those other communities that don't participate in Drupal, Drupal's not a buzzword. It's not something that people recommend. You know, it's possible that we missed the real human experience that we needed to connect to be able to continue to be valuable to people. Just something to think about. Here's another quote from a gentleman named Alex. It was decided that the dollars behind the development would also decide the direction of the CMS. This was the fulcrum changing everything. Larger companies got to push their decisions for Drupal's future that no longer cared for the smaller companies and amateur developers who have now lost their voice. So this is a contentious issue. It's possible that this is a good thing. It's possible that this is a bad thing. It's impossible to say for sure whether it's good or bad. But Drupal is losing market share to WordPress and simple site builders like Wix. And it's fantastic that the Drupal community, you know, with the last keynote that I saw from Dries, is starting to address that problem with some of these out of the box initiatives. I think that's a very good step in the right direction. But again, are we really solving the right problem is the real question that we need to be asking. Again, we've learned that the Drupal hammer really is too big for many jobs and too complex for developers who just need to get a simple job done. We run the risk of excluding new developers and new contributors because the Drupal learning cliff is still very steep. And that's directly from Alex's blog post. So again, you know, I'm trying to incite thought. Gearling also mentions a focus on high-dollar enterprise projects, thereby losing market share to simpler site building platforms. Dries even said D8 Plus is for ambitious digital experiences. But what about those people that don't have ambitious digital experiences? What about those people that are doing a website for their brother or friend that runs a mom and pop business down the corner and they don't need anything complicated? They don't need the enterprise complexity of Drupal. They don't need the consistent security threat of Drupal. They just need to get their message out there, very much as the internet was when I started developing it in the 90s, the early 90s, you know. The end result is HTML. It's a very static thing. It's a very simple thing to deliver, but we've made it so complicated that it takes significant effort. We've created our own industry essentially. And again, are we really solving the right problems, and who are we really solving problems for? I think are very critical things that any open source engineer or technologist needs to ask themselves. So do we care about the total number of sites out there if they're paying more? I mean, really? If you need 1 million small sites to be able to make enough margin to make your investors happy, but you only need 250 very large sites to make those same investors happy, I don't know. It's just an interesting thing to think about in a lot of different ways. And I'm going to leave you to come up with your own conclusions on that. And this is a quote from me. Once you start to disenfranchise the people who help to build the project, you start to have some significant issues. You know, I know many people in the Drupal space that are no longer in the Drupal space. I know many people that have been significant contributors to this community that have burned out or been used or or have been abused, or there's just any number of reasons that they're not here anymore. That's a problem. You've got some of the smartest people in the world that created an amazing project that changed the world. We introduced how open source should work to larger organizations. Organizations like the Cloud Native Foundation, organizations like Kubernetes, who took lessons from us and established governance models that really worked right out of the gate because they were able to see what we accomplished. They were able to see our growing pains. They were able to see what we were doing, and they learned from it. I think Drupal should do the same. They need to look off the island. Drupal needs to get off that island, and they need to look around to learn from other people. We can do more pendulum back and forth between open source communities. We were trendsetters and have set the tone for open source communities in the industry as a result of the popularity of Drupal. People learned from that, readdressed the problem with that additional understanding, and built on it. Drupal needs to go back now and learn from them. Conversely, there are underserved communities that are simply trying to survive. There are a lot of lessons that can be brought to these other communities that we learned here in Drupal. There are people trying to make a living for themselves that could learn a lot from us that we're not engaged with. And we could also learn a lot from them to make sure that we're solving the root problems that we need to continue to be a successful open source project. So I guess really the question is, do we sustain or evolve? People's perceptions do change as a project changes. We all rankle against change, but it happens. As Drupal has evolved, the goals and needs of the project have changed. Drupal has gone in a direction. We're just trying to support it, and the corporate influence and enterprise adoption and financial shift is real. Is it bad? It's different, but many of us in the community aren't there. We're in different environments, and that's what we're trying to address. You know, it's community first for me. It's not business first for me. Drupal is dead. Long live Drupal. Still Drupal, but completely different. So what are we trying to do now? Sustain or evolve? Right? So when we want to be inclusive, not break things or people, and create something useful, you can't be a technical purist. I say that as someone who is extremely pro open source and have made some internal shifts to a couple commercial tools, specifically because they work better and are the best fit to accomplish the goals that I need for that specific problem. What ends up happening is that you have to do things from a product first approach. And what that means is you're really identifying what that root problem is from a human perspective to make sure that you're building your problem or your product to provide value, right? That's business 101. That's what you want to do to be successful. In order to do a product first approach, you have to be able to define the problem you're trying to solve in non-technical terms. That's really hard for engineering folks, like we already covered, or anyone who's in the day-to-day work. You got to know what pain you're trying to solve before you make changes. Otherwise, you wind up hindering someone in some way. Until you understand that problem, all the technical changes in the world won't solve the problem for the user. You know, we use a process of PRDs that is an industry standard. You know, it starts off by really defining what that business case is, what that business problem is. And then from there, you go into maybe a description of how that product can address the business problem. And you use that business problem as a guiding light to make sure that all of your technical decisions from that point forward support the end goal. And what's interesting is I've seen teams transformed from complete chaos where they are incapable of making forward movement. They're doing lots of work, tons of work, lots of really amazing engineering, really smart people doing so many things, but they're not moving the needle towards that goal because that business goal has not been identified properly. So the work that they're doing might feel burdensome after a while because they're taking on so much. They're burning themselves out because they're doing all this amazing stuff, but the problem's not being solved and they don't know why. Stepping back and evaluating where you want to go, what the problem is that you want to solve, and then using a framework to be able to execute on that by defining how the product's going to address the business problem, and then further defining the feature set of that product specifically as it relates to how that product will solve that problem. That gets translated into epics, and then from there you have the ability to go through and start subdividing a massive amount of complexity and technical nuance that the business never needs to understand. And if you remove the word business from that and you just use the word customer or human, it kind of works. For Drupal, it feels like product market research has shifted from doing it for each other to doing it for the big enterprise. When I started working in Drupal, I did it because all my friends were doing it. I did it because I was trying to I wanted to put my pictures on the internet. I thought that was cool. So I found a platform that I could do that with. I suddenly figured out that there was this whole world of other people just like me. I'm a high school dropout. I learned HTML in my mom's basement, essentially, sitting on a very, very, very cheap computer in a very poor scenario. As a result of the hard work and the effort and the learning that I took on myself, I was able to elevate myself through the use of Drupal and through the use of this community. And as a result, I helped enrich many people's lives. I helped contribute to the project in great ways. We were all working together to solve these really cool problems for ourselves. We weren't really solving them for customers just then. There are common things that our CMSs, PHP applications specifically, all have to deal with. Solving things in an open way, kind of like that views example that I gave you, allows us to move on to other problems. It's hard to find and separate those solutions so others can reuse them, but the more we use the frameworks of Drupal 8 and 9, we can start being more impactful in our sister projects. A really great example of this are when you do a composer install of Drupal or you do a composer install of Typo 3. If you would have done that a year ago and looked at that output, you would not have seen a lot of cross-pollination between the libraries that are being delivered for those two projects. They're both PHP-based CMSs. Now, when you do a composer install of Drupal, you see Typo 3 libraries. When you do a composer install of Typo 3, you see Drupal libraries. That is how it should be. The functionality that we're looking to create to solve our problems can be shared and utilized with additional communities that further addresses the problem of getting new people to participate in the community and greatly increases the effectiveness of our engineering efforts. We get more feedback, we get a broader range of use cases, and we know through outreach and communication and working together that we're solving the right problems. It boils down to the pace of innovation. Things are going to continue to change and change rapidly. The takeaway is that the things that do really well are the things that focus on solving root problems, not reinventing the wheel. Dig for the root and you find a group focused on solving it. Join their efforts. No need to lose time and energy and money trying to do it your own way. Apply our open source principles and achieve a more durable result. Working together, the open source ethos, that's what it's all about. It's important to everyone in these communities who can reach out and see what's happening in the world around them and be a part of it. There are solutions in progress out there that are solving the problems that are causing your struggles. No need to struggle when there are others you can collaborate with and come up with a solution that can help everyone. It's almost like one of these cheesy team building exercises. You can't succeed without everybody working together. So another thing that's interesting to talk about, and this is a quote from Ash Dryden. She wrote a really interesting blog post on the ethics of unpaid labor in the open source community. And to summarize, I want to see all people fairly compensated for their labor without feeling forced into it. I do not want to see free and open source software stopped. We can talk about the technical details all day, but the core of open source work is our contributions and collaboration on the project. The pattern seems to be that a project starts out small and open source, maybe grassroots, a bit nerdy, community forms around it and develops a project. Users contribute, enhancing and strengthening the project for everyone. Eventually, as we've seen with Drupal, things get a bit corporate, a bit more commercial, and motivations shift. This is where things can go really wrong. Who is benefiting? Who is doing the work? Without a fair and equitable ecosystem, our communities can be taken advantage of. Plus, not everyone can contribute equally due to various barriers, and that means that some voices aren't heard in the project. Honestly, that's more important at the end of the day, than the latest web of complexity we've spun for ourselves. So take a look at that blog post. I'll have links and references at the end of the slide deck. So removing barriers. How do we flourish? I mean, plain and simple, we have to remove barriers. Every time you have to struggle to do something that's outside of your technical ability, it detracts you from focusing on what you're really good at. There's a time and a place to learn, but when you need to deliver, you want to be able to live in the space where you're competent, not in a whole new space. The more we can help remove barriers, the more we can help solve the really complex problems so people don't have to think about them unless they want to, so they can focus on where they excel, the better off we will be. The more you can find companies that adhere to that ideology, the better off you'll be by surrounding yourself with those people. You know, again, this is why we make tools like DDev. Especially now with COVID, you see people reaching out to open source projects like mine, asking how to support the project financially. People ask about a business model because they want to make sure this open source tool will continue to be around in the future. To deny the fact that people need to be able to make a living in addition to the benefits of open source is pretty privileged perspective. I very much respect folks who won't use anything but open source, but many of us can't live on that in the world as it is today. And I'm no longer able to navigate between slides. So there we go. Sorry about that. So the next section is basically how to cope with all these changes. I'm going to pick it up a little bit because I'm a little short on time. So this is a lot. With Drupal edging more and more into decoupled territory, it's going to take a lot to kind of really focus on these things. Right now, the complexity of today's environment, technically and socially, can be a lot to manage. Drupal has always been complex in and of itself, and not only is this getting more so, but we're adding so much more to it in unique stacks and workflows that the shift to some more static sites is completely understandable. Maybe we've finally outgrown the Drupal hammer syndrome and are more correctly pairing the hammer with a job or selecting a different or a different hammer, kind of like how that pendulum works. Well, as a former and now distant past builder of websites, I have spent plenty of time thinking about this and talking about it with many people who know a whole lot more than I do. And it's been amazing. That's part of the beauty of open source, right? You get to admit that you're not the smartest person in the room. You get to learn from the collective. You get to get better as a result of working with the people around you. That is what Drupal should do. Revisiting problem solving, you know, you get the most amazing minds stating the simplest things. Here's Steve Jobs. If you define the problem correctly, then you almost have the solution. Here's Einstein. If I had only 1 hour to save the world, I would spend 55 minutes defining the problem and only 5 minutes finding the solution. If you look at this as a, you know, I would have looked at this as an active Drupal engineer, I would have not appreciated the sentiment here. I would have thought that both of these people were crazy and that I could engineer a solution that would be perfect in a matter of, you know, give me a night and I'll prove them both wrong. That was me before I had a bit more knowledge. What works for one digital experience may not work for another. It will be hard going forward for vendors to enable the novel workflows, approaches, and architectures required, but what will result is a new grand compromise for a future-ready CMS. This is another quote from Preston. He wrapped it up really well. And I think the real question is, are we up to the task? So just a quick recap. We spent a little bit of time talking about how Drupal has changed. We went over a little bit about what those changes might mean for the future of the project as it relates to the greater open source ecosystem, and gave maybe a few suggestions on how to cope with all this change. I'm not sure the order to take questions now, so I'm just going to go ahead and put up
Thank you. Kevin, very much. We only have a few minutes left.
Mhm.
I do have a couple of questions, and maybe you want to tell people how to reach out to you. I don't know, participants are not aware that you do not have access to the general chat.
Okay.
So maybe if you want to continue the conversation with you elsewhere.
That works. So my Twitter username is CyberSWAT. Definitely reach out to me, willing to talk to anybody. You can bing me in Drupal.org Slack. I am CyberSWAT there as well.
Great. And then we have time maybe for one of the questions from Ruth. It has been noted in various places that Europe does more work on Drupal while USA generates more income. Is this related to the problems you've been talking about?
Very much so. I think that there's a paradigm where there's a very core group that is making money from Drupal and will continue to make money from Drupal. I think that it's possible that they're doing it at, on the shoulders of the people that are doing the work that may not be benefiting in a fair way. That's what I was referring to with Ash Dryden's post, talking about fair and equitable treatment for people that are contributing to open source projects.
Okay, great. And then there's another question from Ruth as well. Drupal has, in my opinion, two big problems. One, maintaining contrib. Many projects are not being maintained well, and it's hard to see in a commercial world how that can be fixed. And two, Drupal has an issue with people not wanting to pay for ongoing security maintenance for small sites. Do you have any thoughts of how this can be addressed?
So a couple of things. Number one, the module system for Drupal is very amorphous. Anybody can create a module. That module does not have to have a good business case that it's solving, right? So I think that one thing that we might want to look at is, like in that views example, really identifying what the problem we're solving is, and then what collection of technology will do that, maybe separate it from the Drupal space a little bit so that it can be shared in a broader context and made a little bit more generic, and then used inside of the Drupal space. I think that's one way to help address the module space, because if the modules are properly defining the business cases that they're solving, you might find that you don't need as many modules, right? That you're getting closer to that root problem and you can solve it more directly. So there may be a case where extra modules are actually adding confusion to the problem. When it comes to the security questions, don't use PHP on the front end. Export everything to static HTML. Use existing libraries, split things up into services so that you can protect the endpoints in different ways. That is the number one way to reduce the security issues with Drupal, period. If you do a search on Google or DuckDuckGo for Drupal and you click that news tab, the first page is nothing but security alerts. It's not new innovation. I hope that helped.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for this reality check. We only have a few seconds left, and we'll make sure to share the slides maybe in the handout here on the platform. Okay. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you all very much for attending. And again, reach out to me if you have any questions. I would love to engage in this conversation a bit more.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all for attending. See you around.